I'm with Ililani Media, a blogger on energy issues and technology and science. Tonight we have three great speakers: Jay Ignacio, president of Helco and perhaps the future leader of HECO. Marco Mengelsdorf, who wants to take over the Big Island energy system from Jay. And Isaac Moriwaki, the lawyer who may resolve this issue. So we will start with Jay.
Is this on? Oh. There we go. Well, good evening. Thanks for coming. Thanks for having me. Let's see, maybe I should give a little bit background of who I am for those of you who don't know me. I'm a local resident, born and raised here on the Big Island in Hilo, and went through the high school system here, public high school, and moved to the mainland, worked on the mainland, well, got my engineering degree first from the University of Hawaii, electrical engineering, then moved to the mainland, worked in the aerospace industry, missed home, like it here, returned home, had my own small business for a little while, and then joined with the telephone company first, and then eventually with Helco 26 years ago. So,
And I should say that we were planning on having them talk for 52 minutes, so 17 minutes each. When there's a 2-minute warning, I'll alert them.
okay. I like to start with this slide because this is where we all choose to live, and it also shows our remoteness in the middle. So I think people who are here, they're interested in sustainability. How do we take care of ourselves in not just good times, but also in some of the emergencies that we need to face? So I think we have more in common than disagreements, really. We're all here in the place we love, and we want to do the right thing for the place that we love. And I wanted to do this because Marco likes to use this slide. I wanted to use it before him. Oops. Over the years, and we have some, surveys that indicate that the three kind of issues that customer interest is for electric energy is the affordability and stability of the energy service. Second comes reliability and resiliency, and then access to renewables. Our customers want access to renewables. Even if they don't have it today, they want the opportunity to have access to renewables, even if maybe in their current circumstances they don't have it. And I think in general, people want and believe that renewables is the way to get to the first goal, and also you can do it and manage the second interest, the key issue, and you do it in a fashion that's much cleaner and it's more self-sustaining. So in the end, using renewables instead of the existing mixture of fossil fuel units is a better way to go. So I think we have a lot of common interests. We do too at the utility, see it that way. The difficulty or the disagreements come is how do you go about doing it? How fast do you do it? What fashion do you go about doing it? That's where the challenges and the long debates come in. For us, we're the electric utility. We have accountability for all of our customers. So going forward, we're committed to 100% renewable, but we don't want to leave anyone behind. Right? We don't want a sector of the customer base or a sector of the community left behind, so that many customers get the benefit of renewables, many customers get the benefit of lower rates, but other customers get higher rates. We don't want to get into that situation. So that's why it's important to take all of these things into consideration and do it right going forward. In terms of renewables, we're already at 48% here on Hawaii Island. Here's the mixture that we have with renewable resources. We have a mixture of geothermal, wind, hydro, and photovoltaic mainly. And most of it, I think the chart is about 17%. Most of it is rooftop solar, self-generation by customers. This is a graph or a map of our island system. So this just shows the locations of the resources on the island. We have 2 wind farms on the island, one on the north end, 10 megawatts, one on the south end for 20 megawatts. And then in the Hilo area, we have 3 hydro units totaling about 14 megawatts. And then we have the PGV geothermal unit, which is 38 megawatts capability. And then all across the island, you have the rooftop solar that everyone's been putting on. But going forward, there's more geothermal resources across the island. So there's opportunities for geothermal resources in different parts of the island. And then wind resources. You have more capability on the north end, you have more capability on the south end. And in the Lalamilo, Waikoloa area, you have one of the best resources in the world. So there's a lot of opportunity for more wind on this island as well. So this is, in the industry now, they're talking about this load profile curve. They call it the duck curve. I like to refer to it as our stack curve. So if you look at this profile, the dark black line, that profiles the energy usage during the course of a day. So it starts in the, at midnight, a low, goes through the morning. As people arise, it goes up. And then it goes down again in the middle of the day, and that's due to less usage because people are self-generating. So during the middle of the day, you actually have less usage. And then as people get home and they start to use more appliances during the evening, early evening hours, about 7, that's when it peaks. So that's the maximum usage, and then it repeats the cycle as people go to bed and get to midnight, and you get the low usage again. Now, you see the light dashed line above the dark line? That's the projected use that would have been there if people had not self-generated. So that kind of gives you an indication, the space between the dark line and that dashed line on top, that gives you the indication of the energy being produced during the day by the photovoltaic systems. Now, there's a strong desire for us to increase, and some people would say just go maximum solar, right? The challenge becomes is that dark profile line encroaches and goes further down toward the bottom of the graph. That's where the challenge comes in, because managing that solar and accepting all of that solar, you would have to remove some of the existing units. And what we show on the stack chart is our steam units and some of our combustion turbines. And these are fossil fuel-based units. So there's a strong desire, and if you don't do the analysis, the simple solution is just remove those units from the stack, and you can add in more solar. The difficulty is from a grid management perspective, from a requirement, is it's not possible at this time to manage the grid without all of those units. We have to use alternative technologies, maybe more batteries, maybe you store the energy and you use it in the early evening when more people are using the energy. So those are some of the solutions that we need to incorporate before we can remove the bottom of the stack. So it's not that we don't support the removal of the bottom of the stack, because eventually we know we're going to have to retire those fossil units if we want 100% renewable. It's how do you go about it? And you want to make sure that when you go to 100% renewable, you don't drive up the cost to an unreasonable level, right? So that's the challenge. And that's where a lot of the debate comes in in the energy sector. How do you do that? How do you do that so you can do it economically? You still maintain the reliability. You want the grid to be stable. You don't want any upset or, like the lightning strikes that we had yesterday and still having today. You don't want those upsets to then collapse the entire system. And that's the issue that we deal with, and that's a lot of the debate that we have in the energy sector. The other thing is those customers, you see that area between the dashed line and the dark line, those customers are generating their own energy. They're staying interconnected to the system, but the revenues that they used to provide to the system is no longer there for the utility. And what it is all the existing customers who don't have self-generation now have to pay for the facilities. So you can create a system where there's disparity, that one group of customers get benefit, but the other group of customers now have to pay for someone else's benefit. And that's a kind of an economic justice situation that needs to be addressed and resolved. So over the years, we've been able to connect, a lot of photovoltaic systems. This is 80 megawatts of photovoltaic. So if you look at this chart, the bottom of the daytime peak is about 100 megawatts. And the highest peak is about 180 megawatts. So you can see in comparison, 80 megawatts of photovoltaic is a lot on our system. So the thinking that we're not connecting systems and we're not supportive, I think is a misconception, because we are pushing the edges. Now, if you look at 80 megawatts, and then you go back and you look at the chart, we're predicting that the limit, at least with the current technologies and the current operation, what we call the system hosting capacity is about 100 to 111 megawatts during the daytime. So we're at 80 and we're encroaching on that system hosting capacity. And what we need to do is to figure out what more technologies that we can put in economically to continue to connect systems, because that's what customers want to do. Now, this is a price chart. So you can see since 2014, our prices have declined over the years to current day. So it started at about 40, and it's down in this chart to 27. But the current rate today is about 30 cents per kilowatt hour. And that decline, we've done productivity improvements, we've done some cost reductions, and there's other factors that also drive up costs. But the decline that you see there is predominantly the decline in oil prices. So we'd like to take all the credit, but we can't. What that shows is a big part of the electric bill is costs for oil to run in our fossil fuel plants, and then costs to pay independent power producers that we buy energy from. And many of those contracts are linked to the cost of oil. So the price has declined, and we're fortunate because of low oil prices. But we have notified the commission that we will be filing a rate request, a rate review. And in fact, Henry was it yesterday, Henry? Henry asked, even before we filed the rate review, Henry asked to participate in that docket. So he's kind of jumping the gun and anticipating that he knows that we'll be filing that. And it's going to be soon. We're going to have advertisements tomorrow and on Sunday to let our customers know that it's coming. And then the filing will probably come out sometime next week, early next week. And then we are going to seek an increase in rates, unfortunately. I wish it wasn't, but we are. I wish I could tell you right now what the numbers are, but to be more respectful to the commission so that they see it first, we're going to not disclose numbers, but we are seeing that it's going to lead to an increase. We're also seeing that if it was approved, it's actually still going to be lower than what your pricing was a year ago. So,
3 minutes left.
okay. So this is another chart showing declining rates, the different rate schedules, same information, just by different class of customers. Interesting, this chart. This is a chart by DBED. It shows household income, the breakdown of what expenses in the typical household on the Big Island. And oddly enough, there's nothing on here that shows electricity as a specific cost item. And, you know, I find that odd that there's so much attention on electric utility bills, yet in a breakdown of household costs, it's not a specific item. I think we dug into the information and tried to figure out. On this chart, it comes out to 2.5%. Part of the cost drivers is being prepared for emergencies. So we put out press releases on how we've been improving our vegetation management program, because this is a critical problem that we need to resolve, the spread of albesias. In our rates, we currently have $2 million allowed to spend for albesia and other vegetation management. We're spending in the level of $8 million a year for vegetation management. So we significantly increased our spending, and that's part of the driver of the rate case that we'll be filing.
Thank you, Jay.
We are getting very good improvements though on this, because vegetation has always been our #1 problem, but year to date, it is no longer our #1 cause of power interruptions. Thank you.
And now Marco will explain what he would do if he were running this utility.
Thanks, Henry. I first wanted to thank Bill and Shirley and everybody at the Community Enterprises for putting this on, and everybody who showed up. It's great to see such a full house and all the seats occupied. It shows how interested I think Hawaii community members are in general in energy issues. And thank Henry for coming over, Isaac for coming over, and it's always a pleasure to sit next to my friend Jay Ignacio. I'm here essentially to introduce you to the Hawaii Island Energy Cooperative, and I thought I'd do that this way. Anybody who's been paying any attention to energy issues over the past couple of years knows that we've been through a real interesting drama, which just ended a couple months ago with NextEra Energy out of Florida essentially losing their attempt to try to purchase Hawaiian Electric Industries and turn it into an arm of NextEra. And this was one of the most extraordinary dockets I think that the state has seen so far. I mean, I think by Henry's calculation, there were over 100,000 pages of documents. There were 22 days, if I'm not mistaken, 22 days of hearings, 3-section of hearings. I didn't attend them all. Henry and Isaac were more masochistic in that way than I was, but I did attend all three segments. And what I wanted to share with you is I was kind of struck by the sense of humor of Tom Gorak. Thomas Gorak was the chief counsel of the Public Utilities Commission during the course of these hearings. And he's a really, I like Tom. I can't say I know him all that well, but he closed the first set of hearings by channeling his inner Jerry Garcia from The Grateful Dead, which was the line he used, "What a long, strange trip it's been." And coming from Tom Gorak, I think that took a lot of people by surprise, because he has a very dry sense of humor. And then for the last section of hearings, the last days of hearings, I went up to Tom during a break and I said, I'm counting on you, Tom, to come up with some type of musical anecdote here. And he said, yeah, you're not the first person to ask me that. So the way he closed the last day of hearings before the case essentially went to the jury being the three Public Utilities Commissioners, was with a quote from Doris Day, 1950s, "Que sera, sera." In translation being whatever will be, and that's as far as I'm going to sing. So we're in the whatever will be stage now. The next era has left, and we're back to our own devices in a sense in terms of what to do with energy here in the state of Hawaii. So it's just a super, super interesting time. Hawaii Island Energy Co-op was a participant on this docket amongst 25 plus participants, of which Life of the Land was, with Henry's group and Isaac Murawaki's Earth Justice and a whole bunch of others. And the reason we came into being essentially is because we wanted to make the case during this really important time, the time being the disposition of one of the oldest, most venerable companies in the state, Hawaiian Electric Industries. We wanted to make the case that the needs and priorities of the Big Island should be on the table, for discussion as the disposition of HEI was being undertaken. So myself and a number of others on the Big Island, we formed this cooperative. We're official 421C under Hawaii state law. We just recently submitted all our paperwork to the IRS for 501c12 status, which is a specific part of the code for electric co-ops. That's going to take a number of months typically for them to make a decision on that. But we're really putting forth what we hoped, which will be essentially a comprehensive energy strategy for Hawaii Island, not just focused on electricity, power generation, distribution, but also transportation, because transportation, in a sense, is kind of the stepchild in that it doesn't get nearly as much discussion, nearly as much attention, and transportation is a huge, huge part of the overall energy consumption of the state of Hawaii. So whatever strategy we come up with and hopefully have the chance to implement should be integrated, focused on renewables, but also, and I fully echo Jay's views that whatever we do here, whether it's HELCO, whether it's a co-op, has to be focused on trying to keep the price of electricity as low as possible and essentially reduce it over time, which we think, and I think my HELCO friends would agree as well, that there is a path to do that with more cost-effective renewables. We are essentially right now a group of 11. There are 6 directors and 5 advisory board members. We're trying to have an inclusive approach here in terms of not just 1 or 2 or 3 individuals, but members of the community for different aspects, different segments of the community. I'll just reiterate Jay's really cool slide, which to me is so representative of how isolated we are here in the state of Hawaii and on this island as far as the supply lines are thousands of miles in different directions, and we really do have a very strong responsibility to try to become more not only energy independent, but more resource independent in general as well, which includes growing more of our own food. The 6 or 7 co-op principles are, I think, pretty self-explanatory there on that particular slide. It's kind of hard for me to read from there, from my vantage point, but I think one of the main points I can make, or I will make as you read the words on the slide there, is that one of the fundamental differences, really key differences between a cooperative versus an IOU, an investor-owned utility, is that a cooperative has only one loyalty essentially, and that is to its members, to the ratepayers. Because the ratepayers, the members, are essentially the owners of the co-op, whereas an investor-owned utility, of which Hawaiian Electric is, HELCO is, MECO is, Hawaiian Electric on Oahu is, and many IOUs on the mainland, is that there's kind of a split loyalty. It's an inherent tension between the ratepayers who want as low as possible in terms of electric costs, right, to minimize their monthly bills, versus the shareholders, those people who own actually own the company. In the case of HEI, for example, there are approximately 107 or so million outstanding shares of HEI stock, about 107 million, and approximately 75% of those 170 million shares are owned by people outside of Hawaii. Now, that's not a good thing, it's not a bad thing, but there is a natural tension between trying to keep electric costs down, trying to take the best care you can of ratepayers, but also provide a lucrative or at least healthy return on investments that have been made by shareholders, which can be far and wide. So that to me is one of the key differences between a co-op and an IOU. Another really important point is that co-ops are controlled by the members. In other words, the directors of a co-op, an actual operational co-op, which we don't have to go too far in this state, just to go to Kauai Island and the Kauai Island Utility Co-op, is that the board of directors is actually duly elected, democratically elected by the members of the co-op, as opposed to board members being from different parts of the community, from different parts of the state that have really perhaps nothing or little to do with the utility company. One of the things that was surprising to me when I got involved with HIEC is that co-ops are not some vestige of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's Rural Electrification Act of 1937, which is actually where co-ops started, by the way, back in 1937, that co-ops are alive and well in the United States in 2016. There are somewhere over 900 co-ops with 42 million co-op members in 47 states. So it's a definite force and very healthy model for utility ownership and utility operations. And we're hoping, given the opportunity, that perhaps the co-op model can be the utility ownership model here in the Big Island if all the cosmic tumblers fall into place properly. So local control, community priorities, rather than, again, that inherent tension between ratepayers or members and shareholders. Lower cost of money as well, typically, because the co-op is a nonprofit, therefore typically has the numbers allow for less interest having to be paid and being able to pass on those benefits, those financial benefits to the membership. So that's it. I wanted to just kind of keep this brief and introduce you in general to the co-op principle, co-op concept, and look forward to discussion later and your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Marco. You finished early. And now, Isaac, for a legal side.
I'm going to try to keep it as non-legal as possible, but you know lawyers, right? Hi, I'm Isaac Moriwake. I'm a lawyer with a nonprofit environmental clean energy law firm called Earth Justice. We actually have offices across the nation, but we have an office here in the Mid-Pacific in Honolulu. We've been doing environmental work for over a generation now, 25 plus years. And we've been involved in clean energy pretty much from, I would say, the most recent ground floor, because Henry's been doing it way longer. But right when things really started taking off, 2008, 2009 on clean energy, especially rooftop solar. So just wanted to share some thoughts from my frontline, experience here. By the way, thank you for inviting me. I really appreciate coming over to Neighbor Island communities to talk. Packing out a room like this on a weeknight is amazing. It never would happen in Oahu, so give your folks a hand. I think that's the benefit of a small community, and it's really important. So with the musical references, I think I'm gonna go with Marvin Gaye tonight, What's Going On? And we're talking about what's ahead for Hawaii's future, but for me, I got to start to find out what's ahead. We really got to find out how we got here, and so that's where I'm going to launch off with the traditional utility business, which is really about. Now we're talking traditionally now. building big fossil fuel plants and then sending that energy to distant customers who just passively switch their light switches on and off. That's the model. It's pretty straightforward, actually. By the way, that's the Hill plant here on this island, which is one of the dirtiest in the state. But as I was saying, this model is pretty straightforward. It gets really geeky when you get into the accounting and the PUC regulatory, the lawyers get involved. But basically, we pay the utilities the cost of building this big infrastructure plus a profit. And that is their business, building and owning stuff. And the bigger, the better. And then another aspect of it is they pass through the fuel costs to the customers. So for example, if oil jacks up to $150 a barrel, we eat that. And so the utilities, have no skin in the game there. Guess what? This is geared towards building a fossil-fueled centralized system. And it worked really well for the 20th century. It gave us this modern electric grid that we enjoy today. But it's increasingly misaligned with our priorities in the 21st century, which is clean, cheap energy that's based here and we don't need to import from far away. Here are some of the big tectonic trends happening in the utility industry. And this is nationwide, or maybe worldwide, but certainly here in Hawaii, we're facing it, front lines. So more and more environmental regulations, clamping down on plants like the Hill plant. Clean energy mandates. Recently, we committed to 100% renewable. Aging infrastructure. How old is the Hill plant? 50 years plus at this point? Something like that. But I mean, that's not the only example, but it's getting old and we have to replace it. Nationwide, people are looking at $2 trillion over the next 20 years to turn over our entire sort of aging electric system, okay? Flat declining demand because of energy efficiency. Our appliances use less, people are installing rooftop solar. So that constant growth that fueled that industrial age boom is no longer there for the utility business. And finally, disruptive technologies. Think cell phones, right? And that's what, this solar, rooftop solar, and maybe the home batteries may be for the utility business. So that's the challenges that our traditional business model is facing. Did I get it all there, more or less? Okay. So we've been called a postcard from the future. And here's a map of Oahu Island 2 years ago showing that a lot of the circuits were filled up at the daytime, at least the nameplate, what they call nameplate, the possible energy that the rooftop solar could be generating was reaching 100% of the daytime minimum load on those neighborhood circuits. So potentially filling up the neighborhood circuits and even starting to send energy higher upstream into the grid. And people are seeing graphs like this. Rooftop solar keeps on taking off. And then there's studies out there that show that rooftop solar and even rooftop solar plus home battery systems together are getting cheaper all the time, and in Hawaii have already landed in a sense that they are cheaper than what the utility can provide you power at. And this is not just a Hawaii phenomenon. It's going to happen right around the corner for a lot of areas across the nation, but it certainly landed first, and that's what this graph is showing here. So, obviously, solar is a threat to the traditional business model focused on building fossil fuel big infrastructure. And so, not coincidentally, we experience roadblocks from the utility. We give credit to the utility when they have constantly been raising the limits for folks to be installing rooftop solar. But it's a lot of headaches, and it sort of goes around and around, and it's a grind, basically. And it's not just solar. The wind industry has also faced challenges here. There's a term called curtailment, basically when the utilities tell the wind plants to shut down and basically throw away the wind energy. And several years ago, it really hit the fan, so to speak, because essentially, the utility didn't want to back down its fossil fuel plants and instead was dumping clean wind energy. And they got kind of in hot water for this. And to their credit, giving credit where credit is due, they did tackle that problem, and they are working to reduce that curtailment. But it's an issue again. The traditional way of making utilities making money getting in the way of clean energy. This all came to a head several years ago when we entered this planning process. And all those challenges, like this perfect storm that's forming, how are we going to forge ahead with this current utility system going forward? It came to a head. And the utility plan that we got initially was basically maintaining the legacy fossil fuel fleet as long as possible, kind of slow walking, getting those retired, and slow walking renewables. It was centered on fossil fuels with more or less renewables kind of thrown in as an afterthought, okay? What the PUC did was basically rejected the plan in its entirety. This has never happened, as far as I know, in the history of utility regulation across the nation. And it really was a monumental thing, again, on a national level. And the PUC went a step further and issued this document here called The Inclinations on the Future of Hawaii Utilities. It's a really compelling read. You can find it online. It's 30 pages. It's super geeky, okay? But if you're interested in this and maybe you need a cure for sleeplessness at night, you can check it out. But basically, the message to the utility was, and this is a direct quote, move to a sustainable business model to address technological advancements and increasing customer expectations. So a lot of challenges facing the utility. You guys have to change the way you do business. And these were the 3 headings for that inclinations document. The generation system, the T&D, in other words, the transmission and distribution, the wires basically, and then policy and regulatory, that framework, right? So really quickly, on the generation side, they said aggressive pursuit of renewable energy, because Hawaii has already entered the new paradigm where wind and solar, renewable energy is cheaper than fossil fueled energy. Retire your fossil fuel dinosaur fleet. Okay, so that was the generation mandate. On the wire side, the T&D side, shift to more of a network type of business. So you're no longer going to be focusing on building those power plants, but you're going to be the integrator of a network, sort of organizing, coordinating a very diverse market with competition, with customer choice. So the network concept idea. And then policy and regulatory reforms, basically getting to the heart of the matter. What's going on, like Marvin Gaye said. We want to look at, should the utility stay in the generation business? Should they move on to something else? Maybe focus more on the delivery business, the network business, and then revisiting this idea of spending money to make money. Remember, that was the industrial age model, right? The more you spend, the more you profit. Well, is that cycle serving the customer interest, the public interest anymore? That was the inclinations, and it really is a beacon for Hawaii for sure. It's still there as the main leading document, the guidance, and it really is even attracted major national attention as well. Again, the concept of a platform, a network, and that's the sort of the way that the utility should be operating and making its money, not necessarily building generation anymore. And then, again, realigning the incentives. We paid the utility to build things before, but now maybe pay them for other ways. And one idea is this, you can't see the small print, but performance-based incentives. So basically, you set the priorities for the utility. We want clean energy, we want customer service, we want rooftop solar, and then depending on how well they do on that, you pay them a lot if they do well, and pay them less maybe, or penalize them if they don't do well. But changing the way they do business, and believe me, money talks, and so that's the concept, right? What was the response to the inclinations? Was it, okay, like this is ABC steps, how we're going to get there? No. It was, let's sell out to NextEra. I mean, frankly, honestly, that was the response. And that took us on a 1.5-year detour, and really, you know, where the inclinations were driving to the utility of the future, NextEra, pretty much everything you saw from them, utility of the past. I won't go into that in detail. How many people went to the listening session when the PUC came out? Okay, give yourself a hand, okay, because this was a team effort. I'm talking about people across the state. The governor, legislators came out in opposition. The people en masse, I mean, a vast majority of the people were opposed to this, and it grew over time. And then the 22 parties, including Marco, including Henry, we were all there giving it our best. And you know how it ended up, but I just wanted to note that central to this idea of the utility of the past that NextEra would have brought was this idea of LNG, the bridge to clean energy, they call it, but more like the bridge to nowhere or the bridge to more LNG, the way I could see it. But we're past that, right? So maybe not dwell so much on the past, but I do want to emphasize that really NextEra was the culmination of this broken system, okay? I mean, it wasn't an accident, it wasn't a mistake. It was a mistake, okay? And you know, I think people have to take responsibility for that, and I'm hoping to hear from, you know, HECO executives and, you know, about what happened, really, and not just forget about it, sweep it under the rug. But it wasn't just a mistake, it really was this system that gave us NextEra or whatever. It's sort of like the culmination of that top-down utility system. Okay, what's next?
And 3 minutes.
Okay. So here's a bunch of things cooking at the PUC mostly. And we're going kind of in descending order of how active it is, okay? So starting off with what's the plan? We talked about the plan that the PUC rejected. That was the first plan. We're now on version 4, round 4. And hopefully we're gonna get it right this time. It's due December 1st. LNG's out because the HECO companies tied LNG to NextEra. NextEra was rejected, so the HECO companies recently announced no more LNG for now, so we'll see. But again, the plan has to be renewables first, and then maybe fossil fuels for the time being, supplementing that where necessary. It's been the opposite so far. It's been, again, the traditional utility plants and renewables thrown in for the heck of it. We got to reverse that, change the paradigm. The other thing is customer solar and batteries. There's a case that will determine the future market for distributed solar and distributed batteries. I think there's a current program that just capped out recently, and so the solar industry is very much in limbo, but we're hoping that the PUC will get going to show us the direction of the next wave of customer-based clean energy. One of the big things that we still haven't done is to recognize the benefits of customer clean energy. We talk about how some people put in solar and that's a burden on other customers. Well, it's also a benefit to your neighbors, it's also a benefit to the grid, and we haven't even begun to start recognizing and quantifying that. That's on our to-do list. And then utility incentives, we already talked about this, moving towards performance-based incentives, and then revisiting this concept of risk, especially, for example, fuel costs. So why do the customers have to bear all the risks when oil spikes? Why shouldn't the utility feel at least a little part of that, have a pinky on the table, so they're responsible and move on from this fuel-based system? And then, again, at a higher and higher level, really, or more fundamental level, really looking at how do we change the system so it works for the customers and works for the public first.
Thank you. Thank you.
Here's the list, and we can talk about it in questions. There's a $1 million study that's going to be conducted. Marco talked about co-ops and munis. There's this thing called an independent system operator, And then Parker Ranch here on this island is getting to this idea of microgrids, building a new grid from the bottom up. And that's just, some concepts of how we can build the grid of the future.
So I encourage people to fill out cards, and while I collate some questions, Rep. Lowen will come up and make a couple of comments.
Thank you.
You have to sit down for this mic on that one.
Oh, okay. I appreciate you inviting me up to say a few brief words. Just to kind of recap, a lot of what we just heard. I think the legislature in recent years has created a lot of incentives to push forward renewable energy, and as a consequence, we see a lot more renewable energy in the state, a lot more solar customer-generated renewable energy as well. And as Isaac mentioned, I feel like over the past year and a half, we've been kind of on hold, waiting to see what the next step is while we're waiting to see what the outcome would be of the proposed merger or sale. And so I think the next step moving forward is, if we're going to continue to adopt renewable energy, we've kind of reached a point where we need to start looking at how we're going to accommodate it, how we're going to replace base load, how we're going to create a more flexible and resilient grid that can accommodate distributed energy resources so that people aren't forced to go off grid, which, as Isaac also mentioned, is now becoming almost the same price as staying on grid for some people. So, there's a lot of different solutions. I think we should keep our mind open to all the different solutions: energy storage, smart grid technology, potentially alternative utility models, as Marco discussed, looking at, of course, most importantly, greater efficiency, and then always keeping in mind what is the impact going to be to our customers, to our ratepayers, and to our taxpayers. And I think, the ideas of performance-based rate making is really important. And we're also looking forward, Isaac mentioned, thank you, the $1.2 million study that we funded at the legislature last session. So hopefully we'll see some movement on that, and we'll learn something new about potential models for our utility of the future. And just thank you all for coming out to Kona. I can tell you that my experience talking to my constituents, and when I do surveys and talk to people when I'm campaigning and things like that, is energy is the issue that's most important to people out here, one at least up there with the top priorities. So really appreciate you and Community Enterprises putting together this panel.
Yes, thank you, Community Enterprises. Thank you, Rep. Lowen. And now let's fire into some questions. First question, and each panelist should be brief so that we can get through all these questions, although we'll make the questions available, so if we don't get through to any, all the people here can respond later. The first question is, if the solar plus battery that Isaac was talking about is now equal to or cheaper than the grid-based electricity, and solar and batteries are both becoming cheaper and cheaper and cheaper as the years go on, why would anybody want to own the grid?
John Kimball?
You want to buy? Isaac.
Well, I think we got a John Kimball on this. So, why don't we go with the current owner and then?
Yeah. I still see the grid, the electric utility, as an integral part of the future, even if you have that. Like I said, going forward, you're going to have a sector that can do that, but you're going to have a sector that cannot. That model may not work for large industry facilities, large hotels. So you're still going to have that grid. Someone's going to have to operate it. So, as an incumbent utility, we've been doing it for over 100 years. So I think there's still value for our customers instill value for the community. And it's important that we don't take the approach and the attitude that, just disregard the grid, destroy it, or, whatever you may think, and be careless about it. I don't think that's the right approach. There's still value in the grid, and I still think it's a necessary part of the energy future.
I agree. I agree. There's synergies to the grid, the network advantages to the grid of people sort of collectively being interconnected, okay? There's a public good involved there. And that's exactly why we have to make sure we create the right incentives so people stay interconnected and interactive and engaged in the grid and not just drop off entirely. So we're going to lose that collective network benefit. Frankly, there's a lot of concern now that we're not allowing that. When these programs cap out, like the programs where the rooftop solar owners can connect to the grid and get compensated for what they provide their neighbors, what they provide the grid. When those things get capped out and there's no pathway for people to stay interconnected, what's going to happen? You give people no other alternative at a certain point than to drop off. And I think that's bad policy for exactly the reasons that Jay said. But it's up to our leadership, ultimately, the utility, because they're big at the regulatory level, and then ultimately the regulator, the PUC, to make sure we establish that right direction.
And Marco, in answering that question, you might combine it with this one, which is, when might you make a bid for the utility, and how much might you bid for it in dollars and cents?
I knew that question was going to come up, Henry. So thank you for bringing it up sooner rather than later. In response to the first part of your question, it is, as I'm sure you could probably understand, it's our policy not to comment on any possible ongoing discussions that may be taking place between HIEC and Hawaiian Electric. I mean, if the big if there's any deal to be made, it's not going to be made in a public forum. It's not going to be made through the media. It's not going to be made in the press. So we'll keep that to ourselves. In terms of price, I mean, ultimately, it's going to depend on, of course, a willing buyer and a willing seller determining a fair market value, right? Fair market value for what Hawaii Electric Light Company would be. And one of the few numbers that I've seen bandied about, and this goes back to just recently departed, not from this earth, but from his office, Jeffrey Ono, who is the state's consumer advocate, real good guy, who opined in a forum July of last year in Hilo, a book value of Helco and somewhere in the $720 some odd million range. My friends at NextEra, I got to know some of those people in the course of the process. When I talked to one of my friends there at some point regarding the price of Helco, he told me, well, you can't afford it. But one of the figures I've seen bandied about is, as high as $1 billion with a B, $1 billion. But again, if there is a deal to be made, it's going to be based on some type of mutually agreed upon figure. I would imagine somewhere, in the $700 million to something higher range.
Jay, there has been in the paper a number of reports of different companies that might now be interested in buying your company. Are you talking with, are you aware of, are you involved with any of those? Including HIEC and your friend sitting next to you.
Not me personally. And from a corporate standpoint, I'm not aware of any discussions like that going on. And that's why it was odd that, after some statements were made in the public, Hawaiian Electric Industries actually came out kind of out of character in saying that there is no offer and the company is not for sale. Typically, we don't do that. But in this particular case, after the NextEra merger, there were some public statements made that there's other suitors, and that's when Hawaiian Electric Industries came out and says, no, we're not up for sale, we're not putting ourselves up for sale, and there are no other suitors at that time.
For Isaac, isn't there a risk in a co-op of ideology over engineering?
Maybe you have to be more specific. Ideology.
Wouldn't they want renewables so much and not really have any engineering understanding, and therefore there'd be a risk of new people taking over an existing utility?
In a co-op situation?
Yeah.
Well, it all goes to the leadership. So, yeah, I'm not sure. They still have to run a business, essentially. So I'm not sure how it could totally go off track, even if,
But would you intervene if they made the bid?
Oh, you're talking about a particular co-op. Well, it kind of depends. I mean, there's a lot of stuff happening, and maybe, Henry, you would cover that base.
So, Marco, where would you find the money?
In my adventure here, this odyssey of being involved with the HIEC, one of the things initially that I was asking myself is, gee, $700-800 million bucks, that's a lot of money. Where could I find that? You could do huli chicken sales for quite a while, I suppose, or car washes, but you'd probably take a very long time to come up with that money. But what has been pleasantly, and I don't want to sound too cocky or too arrogant here, but what has been a pleasant surprise is the interest that we have received by a number of parties that make it their business to finance and support the establishment of electric co-ops in the United States. And it's not granola eating people, with organic yogurt dancing to the tune of Jerry Garcia and Parks in San Francisco. I mean, these are
Stereotypes.
not that stereotype, Isaac. I mean, these are multi-billion-dollar organizations that are very well respected, that have billions and billions in assets. So again, I don't want to come across as too cocky here, but from my preliminary conclusion, I mean, there doesn't seem to be, wouldn't in principle be any problem with finding that kind of money. And finally, I'll close by saying that, again, a vestige of the Rural Electrification Act of 1937 is that the federal government, through the USDA, U.S. Department of Agriculture, is involved in the funding of co-op establishment, co-op formation. And if you can have money that's guaranteed by the federal government, in this case the Rural Utilities Service, or RUS, under the USDA, then you get the cheapest possible money available. So one of the big and pleasant surprises is that if there is a deal to be had, I'm led to believe that there is certainly money available to make the deal possible.
Isaac, could you explain what feed-in tariffs are?
That's a question?
Yes.
Okay. Feed-in tariffs are a way to spur renewable adoption. I don't want to call it program is overused, and for me it's getting worse and worse connotation all the time. But essentially you pay sort of a premium price for renewable energy to try to spur investment in renewable energy. So it's a type of renewable incentive mechanism that was very, very successful actually in Europe. Of course, the incentive mechanism that has worked really well for Hawaii up to a year ago was net energy metering, which is a different type of arrangement. But feed-in tariffs is similar but different type of way to get renewables going.
And Jay, for your question, since there's a proposal to build a large commercial solar facility in Ocean View, but to break it up into 27 little pieces in order to get this bonus windfall profit. How do you feel about that?
Okay, let me add to Isaac's answer on feed-in tariffs. A common, I guess, unhappiness with the utility is when we negotiate with potential producers of energy.
Jay, would you get closer to the mic?
Oh, you can't hear it? Oh, okay. So when we get into negotiations, it takes a long time, and it may frustrate the potential producer of energy. So one of the purposes of the feed-in tariff is to have a standard rate so that producers of energy can look at that tariff and publicly see that, okay, if I can make my project profitable or make it work and benefit at that published rate, then they can plan much better. And the utility has already a pre-posted set of agreements that they can bid into. That's what moved the feed-in tariff forward here in the state. We developed the feed-in tariff, worked with a number of parties. I don't know if Isaac was part of it. It was a long process to develop it. It had the set of requirements that, was put forth with the commission. All the parties reviewed it. And then we had the tariff in the program made available. And then you had all these parties bidding into or subscribing to the feed-in tariff. So what Henry is referring to is projects down in south, the Kau area, Hawaiian Ocean View area. They have feed-in tariff agreements with us, right? And what Henry is referring to is you have one entity that has actually developed 27 different individual ones, and is that proper, or is that the right thing to do? Well, we publish this approved program, and when you go through the requirements and you look at the requirements and what you need to meet on those requirements, our review said that, yeah, they met the requirements, so we're going to allow them to do their feed-in tariff project. And by the way, there is an independent observer of this process, not the utility, independent observer. So we went through the process, and that's how we approved the projects. That's what happened. Now, there is a formal complaint now before the commission saying that that wasn't properly approved, that those projects are actually invalid, and then we need to go through that complaint process with the commission to determine yes or no what's going to happen going forward.
So, Marco, when you take over the utility, are you going to honor the IBEW contract?
I don't see any reason why not. I mean, to go back to a previous question, the idea that you'd have a bunch of ideologues taking over a utility company with no idea how to run a utility company is really preposterous. I mean, you need people who know how to run a utility company to run the utility company. So if we were to get to that point of taking ownership of the utility company here, I would expect and imagine that anybody who wanted to stay from Helco would have the opportunity to do so. There wouldn't be some wholesale cleaning house where you sweep out the old and bring in the new. That makes no sense at all. You want to be able to have the trained personnel who not only know how to do it in theory, but who have been doing it day in and day out for years and years.
And I would add that you're still subject to PUC regulation too.
Absolutely. Just because it's a co-op doesn't mean it's somehow in some super special category that's not subject to the Public Utilities Commission.
Isaac, we have green waste rotting all over Hawaii, turning into CO2 and methane. Why can't we turn it into useful energy?
Good question. Jay?
There are many options that come before us, right? That we evaluate. Many people come to us and say, I have a project, this will work. But remember the interest that I went through? in the beginning of the presentation, many of these projects don't meet the first one, the affordability one. And that kind of gets in the way. It's a good project, it's a clean source of fuel, but is it going to drive up rates? And, we have direction from the commission to look for lower cost renewable energy.
So I'm going to break down the formality just a little bit, but people have talked sort of daydreaming level about if Albezia is of such a problem, what would it take to just burn that or whatever. I heard maybe there's some emissions concerns about that or whatever. Do you know anything about that?
We have these Albesias, which are invasive species, right? And they create problems when they fall across roadways, they fall across our power lines. So we've been trimming them and, actually herbiciding them to eliminate the hazards from our power lines and highways. It seems like a natural solution is you just take those Albesias and you actually use them in a power plant for a biomass facility. And actually KIUC is doing that. But that form of energy on KIUC is one of the higher costs of energy. And in fact, we're still, we had approved a biomass contract, which was approved for the Public Utilities Commission. Early this year, we actually canceled that contract. Of course, the independent power producer is going to have a different view, but our view was that they had not met the performance requirements, the timeline of that project, so we canceled it. But we're still in negotiations with them. We see if we can get a viable project working with them. We looked at Albesias to see if Albesias can be used in that power plant. The difficulty with Albesias is harvesting and hauling to the facility. And right now also they have permit requirements, and the permit requirements doesn't allow that type of fuel. So there's some challenges to overcome if we're going to use Albesias, but we want to see if it's possible.
Yeah, I'm just wrapping it up. Good question. It's so ubiquitous. You wonder if you can make use of it.
Marco, what are your options if HECO and HELCO say no? Hostile takeover?
Contrary to the power of eminent domain, which for those who perhaps aren't quite familiar with that term, essentially eminent domain allows a government entity, whether it's a city, county, state, or federal, to encroach on private rights and private property to the benefit, in principle, to the benefit of the community interest writ large. And for example, if Maui County determined that it was in their best interest to attempt to essentially a takeover of Maui Electric Company, the mayor there, Alan Arakawa, could, in theory, go for what I believe would be a hostile takeover of Maui Electric through the power of eminent domain. As could the city and county of Honolulu, in principle, try something similar with Hawaiian Electric Company on Oahu. Now, I happen to believe that any talk of such a, again, in my opinion, would be a very hostile takeover. I happen to believe that it's extremely unlikely, if not very, very far-fetched, that we are at a point, whether it's the county of Hawaii, county of Maui, city and county of Honolulu, that action would be undertaken as a serious possibility. But by contrast, a co-op has no such power of eminent domain, and I think it wouldn't make too much sense to me in principle that a co-op would try to, let's say, drum up public support if we had received a firm and definitive no. which I'm not saying we have or haven't, but if we had, that would somehow make sense that we would generate some type of public campaign, roadside signs, petitions and so forth, to try to force a private company, in the case of HEI, to sell to a co-op. So I don't even know if that's ever been successfully done anywhere in the United States. So
I like a Harry Kim $10 signs along the side of the road to take over the utility. Here's a legal question for you, Isaac. Since King Kalakaua authorized Hawaiian Electric Company to first farm, and since they are a public utility and their assets are paid for by ratepayers, why are all the assets considered part of a private company?
So that's the inherent tension that Marco alluded to. The franchise, the ability to be a monopoly and have this territory and serve your customers, is something that the state, via the legislature, has given Hawaiian Electric's utilities. But the assets are privately owned. I hope that makes sense.
Marco, you mentioned possibilities on Maui. Are you familiar with the Sacramento Municipal Utility District? And could something like that occur here?
Well, what Henry's referring to is what's known as SMUD, Sacramento Municipal Utility District, which is essentially a muni for the Sacramento area. I mean, when you say could it happen here, that would depend on the willingness of the current ownership of the utility companies here, of which, other than KIUC, which is a co-op, you have, again, Hawaiian Electric on Oahu, Maui Electric for the 3 islands of Maui County, and then this island. So there would have to be a willingness on both parties, both the city and county of Honolulu or the county of Maui or the county of Hawaii, to proceed in that direction, and then for Hawaiian Electric Industries to be willing to go down that path.
Jay, why would the utility be more in favor of large centralized solar facilities instead of putting solar on everybody's roof?
The advantage of a central station photovoltaic facility would be lower costs. When you have a large scale, you have the ability to get better pricing for the solar panels. You'd have better pricing for the inverters because of the scale. And then you could pass on that savings to all customers. Also, Isaac may disagree, but also where you have a central station, you have one interconnection, you have control over that facility from a utilities perspective. You have less investment for one central station facility versus now, as Isaac talks about, a network where you have to invest in a network and you have to manage all of these smaller installations. So from a system standpoint, it's more economical to do central station. Here on Hawaii Island, we had the opportunity to do central station years ago, even before that uptake on rooftop solar, and we consciously decided not to do that. Because even if it was more economical, what I had foreseen was that if we did it, then we would have made it harder for other customers to do it themselves, because we would be taking that capacity on the system, the system hosting capacity that I talked about. So we stopped all of our projects. We had a bunch of projects set up. So even if it was more economical and it would have driven costs down, we would have taken away the choice from customers. So we consciously decided not to do it on this island.
So Marco, you've taken over the utility and people are clamoring for more rooftop solar. How would you upgrade the grid to accommodate that?
Oh, that's a great question, Henry. It's a great question. And can I piggyback on what Jay said? I see an inherent tension between rooftop solar, which I have on my house, and probably a lot of you have on your homes as well, which is great. I mean, it gives us more energy independence, it lowers electric bills, there are juicy tax credits, it's a really feel-good purchase or acquisition. But like Jay was saying, I mean, rooftop solar is not as cheap as centralized solar. There are economies of scale. So there's an inherent tension between promoting rooftop solar, but also wanting to promote a model for more renewables, that not just more renewables, but cost-effective renewables, cheaper renewables. For example, KIUC is bringing on their third utility scale power plant in the months to come. The first with dispatchable battery storage, which by the way means that you produce power during the day and have it available for evening peaks, which my understanding is the first in the United States to do that. So kudos to KIUC for doing that. But like Jay was saying, I mean, if you are skewing heavily to centralized solar, which is cheaper, which is better for all ratepayers, right? Then you are, in some form or fashion, reducing the ability of the grid to accept more and more and more rooftop solar. So there are trade-offs to be made between more expensive kind of micro power plants on people's homes and cheaper, larger scale generating facilities that will help us collectively get to higher percentage of renewables faster. And there's not a solution to that. So whether it's an IOU, investor-owned utility, or a co-op, you're still dealing with some of the inherent intrinsic challenges and trade-offs, and also engineering challenges of just how much, again, what makes us so different here in the state, we have these isolated island grids that aren't interconnected, whereas the continental US, east to west, north to south, is all kind of one massive grid. And I'll put on my other hat for a moment here in terms of being a solar company owner, which is, and Jay was saying, I think they're up to about 80 megawatts now, and the peak last December, typically the Helco peak takes place in December, okay? The peak as of last December was about 190 megawatts. 190 megawatts. What's a megawatt? 1 million watts, or 1,000 kilowatts, okay? 190 megawatts was the peak in December. I've counted up all the PV that's in the pipeline right now. This is part of the public record. All the PV that's in the pipeline, either installed, approved to be installed, or considered to be, or under consideration to be installed, and comes out to about 110 megawatts, 110 megawatts. Now, not all those 110 megawatts are going to be installed ultimately, but I'm not an engineer like Jay is, but I do understand that in today's world, in the grid of 2016, not the fantasy grid of the future, but in today's world, you can't have an infinite amount of power feeding into a finite grid. And going to battery storage, whether it's on the customer side of the meter, on a home and business scale, or going to utility scale battery storage, we are just at the beginning of this journey. It is expensive, it's going to take tweaking, it's going to take adjustments, and it's going to take time as we go towards this new utility model. But for here and now and in the near term, you can only feed so much power into a finite grid.
That is a great lead-in for the next question for Isaac, because there has been really intense debates both in Hawaii and nationally about cost shifts, whether they exist, whether they don't exist, which way they go between central solar and rooftop solar. What are your feelings on that, Isaac?
Okay, wait, there's two issues there in that question. There's the cost shift issue, which doesn't have to do with utility versus rooftop solar. It has to do with solar versus the traditional utility model we were talking about. And then the second issue is utility or rooftop, okay? So we need to unpack that a little bit. Look, we're at 23% renewable right now for the state. That's great, considering that we were over 90% dependent on oil just a little while ago. But flip that around, and I'm sorry, I'm bad at math. What, 77%? Way to go? We have a long way to go. We need an all of the above strategy, and to me, I think we have to maximize rooftop solar and then everything else, you know what I mean, to get to 100, realistically. I just want to walk back this assumption. It's just like people take it as a given that rooftop solar is more expensive than utility scale stuff. Maybe, but you got to do the analysis, and you can't just assume that. There are scale benefits. The bigger, the better, or whatever, and you can spread your fixed costs over a larger project. Okay, that's basic economics 101. But we're in Hawaii, where land is scarce and is at a premium. Maybe not so much of an issue in Big Island, where you got a lot of land. Okay, so that's not a cost. Certainly on Oahu, where there are a lot of stuff developed, your development pathway is so much easier if you just stick it on your roof. And maybe in Hawaii in general, I call it the super ferry effect. If folks haven't recognized, like sometimes it's hard to get big things through, Nextera being a prime example. So just on the basic nuts and bolts level, really, is utility scale that much cheaper in Hawaii than rooftop solar, okay? And then that's one. The other thing is, again, as I mentioned in my opening presentation, you gotta look at the benefit side of rooftop solar as well, and that we haven't even started here in Hawaii. And that's the shame, where we're like canceling programs, capping people out of how they can send power to the grid, and we haven't even started recognizing the benefits that customer solar provides to your neighbors and to the grid. In the mainland, they've been doing those studies. A lot of the studies show that, forget the subsidy, there's actually a net benefit under net metering. So even getting compensated at the retail rate in some places, customers are still subsidizing their neighbors. Right? Their neighbors are not, or their grid's not subsidizing them. It's going the other way. They're helping the grid on a net basis. So you got to look at the costs. You got to look at the benefits, and we need data, not just drama.
Okay, here's a question for all three of you, and we'll start at Marco and move down the line. Let's say for a moment that somebody handed you a bucket of money. You said you could raise $1 billion. Let's say that you're each given a bucket of money, and so money was not the issue. How fast could you get to 100% renewable energy?
I think anybody who answers that honestly, Henry, would have to say it's a very speculative exercise, and I'm always somewhat chagrined at a political system where it's all too easy to come up with a rather arbitrary date, as in 2045, which by my math is 29 years from now. 29 years from now, and pick this date into the rather distant future that, by golly, this is when we're going to be 100% renewable in power generation. As far as how fast it could be done with $1 billion, I haven't crunched the numbers, but I think let me answer that this way. In the real world, it makes a lot more sense, I think, and practically speaking is going to be significantly easier to get to 90–95% than it is to get that last 5 or 10%, at least given what we understand to be kind of more or less current storage technologies, which, and a little bit of a tangent here, and I've been in the energy field now for 38 years. And I've seen a lot of interesting developments, needless to say. But one of the analogies that just drives me bonkers is equating what's gone on with cell phone technology, and somehow that's going to be analogous to what's going on in the utility sector. I think that is just so out there and so fundamentally incorrect. So whatever we see in terms of battery storage is not going to be akin to Moore's law in terms of computing speed. It's not going to be akin to the price dramatically dropping year to year. I hope it would be, but I don't believe that to be the case. I think in terms of power generation, distribution, transmission distribution, it's going to be much more incremental, the changes, rather than revolutionary overnight driven by a Samsung, driven by an Apple, driven by someone like Mr. Elon Musk.
Jay?
Repeat the question again, because I think it's key.
You're given a pile of money. You're given Marco's $1 billion. And you're told you're going to have a profit incentive, a profit motive. You'll make more money the faster you get to 100%. How fast could you get there?
See, that's kind of the difficulty with that kind of question, because it has only one parameter, 100%. And
Okay, 110%.
no, it's more than that. It's, do you get there, right? And do you make it affordable to customers? And do you maintain the same
Well,
reliability?
no, because Marco is giving you the $1 billion, and therefore you don't have to pay him back. So how fast can you get there if you're given the money to get there?
So we could do it quite quickly if that's the only parameter, right? You go off, and this would upset Isaac, of course, but you go off, you get a biofuel contract, and you use it in the existing plant. Or you could build out wind farms, and you could do pump storage hydro, possibly. So you could do it faster, right? But that's a hypothetical. It's not the real world, right? The real world is you have to account for the other things. You know, it would be easy if we says, well, let's just disregard reliability, right? Some people say the utility is hiding behind reliability. No, that's a reality. That's physics. You know, whether it's a co-op, whether it's, you know, a municipal, whether it's investor-owned utility, that's reality. You know, so I don't know. That's a hypothetical question. The other thing is, even if you had the money, you have to go through the process of getting projects completed. You have to go through that, right? And you have to vet through the process of having people accept your plans, even if you have an unlimited amount of money to go and do things. So, you know, it's not just money. And even going forward, you know, in our updates or plans, we still have a component of geothermal in our plans. We still have components of wind. But we're not going to get, we put it in our plans, but the reality is we're not going to get additional geothermal unless people accept it, unless government assists us. It's not a utility thing to do alone. Even if it's renewable, right, it meets the criteria, it's the thing to do. We can do it safely, we can do it away from residences, we can find a viable project. We're not going to get that done alone. It's got to be a cooperative process, ourselves, the community, government. So it's not just about money, it's more than just money to getting it to 100%.
Okay, so back to the original question, and then I got branches in response. I think we could do it faster than 2045 and probably do it cheaply too. That's my opinion. And it's not just sort of this magical like cell phones vision or whatever, although I think that's a big part of it. We don't know what's coming really. The amazing thing about this rooftop solar boom, the last 5 years or so, if you look at the plans going into this period, like the policy folks, the leaders, executives, like no one really saw it coming. And the estimates were like, oh, a little bit here or there or whatever. Nothing close to the scale that we've seen, you know, just in a few years. I think the next 5 years is going to be to solar and batteries what the last 5 years were to rooftop solar. That's just the tip of the iceberg. I think we can get to 100 quicker. I think we need to. I mean, there's a climate crisis. Just we're seeing it this past couple weeks, and as ambitious as, you know, maybe Obama's Clean Power Plan is, it's just scratching the surface of what we need to do as a nation, and then to the larger global community. We need all of the above to avert disaster, basically. It's not just about rates. It's about survival at this point. But, I mean, I'm looking at a report done by this really, really smart guy, professor at University of Hawaii. And he's modeled out scenarios of how to get to 100%. And it's looking like mostly solar and wind. And of course, you need some kind of storage to on a seasonal basis and on a time-to-time basis. So he's seeing that hydrogen will work as a storage medium, or maybe batteries, and then maybe some sort of biomass or biofuels or whatever, again, the time to sort of tide us over or whatever, to fill in the gaps. But again, it's clean first and then things to back it up, right? And his findings are, assuming you do it by 2045, we'd be paying for this system 16 cents per kilowatt hour. Okay, so there's gonna, I mean, it does involve a lot of radical change. I mean, we have to start treating demand, the way we use energy, totally shift the way we do it, whatever, you know what I mean? Start use energy when the sun is shining, kind of thing. And so it takes a lot of creativity and a lot of radical transformation, but it's possible and it's cheap. And it's just a matter of whether we want to slow walk this or whether we're really committed to changing the way we do things because we have to.
We're down to the final 3 questions. Jay, would you favor performance-based rate making to encourage the utility to incentivize getting more renewables onto rooftops?
In our situation, yes, because we're at 48% and we're not being compensated for exceeding the RPS requirements. And we're supportive, but it needs to be vetted through and it needs to be fair, you know. So one of the questions is co-op model versus investor-owned, and, you know, I just wanted to talk about what drives the investor-owned utility, and it's the same. It's servicing our customers. If we don't serve our customers well, it's not going to lead to serving the investors well. So it's the same model. You have to focus on your customers. You have to take care of the people that you serve. And, you know, I think having performance-based metrics, measuring how well we serve customers, I think it makes sense.
Marco, the Helco is in the process right now of buying Hamakua Energy Partners in Honoka'a. They originally intended to power it with LNG, but now that NextEra is gone, they're not going to power it with LNG. If you were owning the utility right now, would you acquire Hamakua, and what would you power it with if you bought it?
You know, great question, Harry. I want to go back just briefly to a really important point that the kind of last set of questions brought up in terms of renewable energy penetration here. I mean, I remember one of the first energy conferences I attended was the Sheraton in Honolulu back in 1981. And ever since then, 35 years later, there's been, one of the mantras has been, gee, we have some of the richest renewable energy resources here in the world. We've got solar, we've got wind, and on this island we have geothermal. In principle, it sounds great. This bounty of renewable, clean, green, ostensibly cheap renewable energy on this island. You go just a little bit below the surface of that, and you will see, for example, that let's look at geothermal, which we have the biggest source of renewable energy on this island is geothermal. And you could probably, in principle, double it, triple it, or more. Because it's not just in Puna, but there are other areas of the Big Island that have geothermal resources. But it is such a hot topic, literally and figuratively, that you've got groups on this island who are against even passive sonar, passive survey work to see what the geothermal resource is. And I'm not saying that's good, I'm not saying it's bad. And a very reasonable question would be to someone who's interested in the co-op like I am, well, what do you think? What does the co-op think about geothermal? Well, the co-op thinks about geothermal is that it's not for us, whether it's the 5 directors or 6 directors and 5 advisory board members, to decide such an important issue. It should be for the people of the island to decide, the members of a co-op ostensibly to decide whether it's geothermal, solar, or wind that's the best way forward. So you go from the theoretical to the practical in terms of more renewable energy. It sounds all well and good, but there's some really, really difficult, hot issue, passionate questions about more geothermal, less geothermal, more wind farms, less wind farms. So what was the question again, Henry? I'm sorry.
What would you do with Hamakua Energy?
Okay, HEP. So just briefly, there are a number of independent power producers on this island. In other words, Helco does not own all the generation assets, right? There we have Puna Geothermal, which is independent. We have the wind farm in South Point, which is independent. We have HRD, Hawaii Renewable Development in North Kohala, which is independent. And then there's Hamakua Energy Partners in Honokaa, and there's a deal afoot. It's before the commission, if I'm not mistaken, for Helco to buy Hamakua Energy Partners, which is it the biggest? It's the second largest generation facility on the island behind Keahole. Is that right, Jay?
Both are the same size, 60 megawatts.
60 megawatts, so it's substantial, it's not Manini. So does it make sense for the utility company on this island to actually acquire more generation? I'm kind of agnostic on that. I haven't taken the deep dive into the numbers. I mean, Jay and the folks at Hawaiian Electric have, and they've decided that this makes sense. So I have no reason to dispute that, the analysis that they made. In terms of fuel source, okay, what I do know is that there are 2 combustion turbines that Helco owns at the Keahole facility, made by General Electric, and there are 2 similar, if not identical, combustion turbines at Hamakua Energy Partners. Now, it's conceivable that you could switch over the fuel source from the current fuel source to propane, which is a natural gas, but it's not LNG, right? And if it were to make sense to switch over to something like propane because it's in the best interest of the utility company and the best interest of the ratepayers because it would be a cheaper fuel compared to petroleum, then that would make sense to look into that possibility. Not only would it be cheaper, but it would be better in terms of pollutants. So pending further determination, one can or could make a case that switching over from the current fuel source for these particular 4 combustion turbines to, let's say, propane does have some merit and is worthy of consideration.
And Jay would like to make a comment on this.
Okay, the logic or strategy behind the proposed purchase is we have a commitment to that contract for another 15 years. And when we evaluated that commitment, because we have to pay monthly to Hamakua Energy Partners a fee for being available. So when we looked at the cost of paying that fee monthly versus actually owning it and doing the economic analysis, we came to the conclusion that it's lower cost to customers to actually have utility ownership versus not. And also Marco mentioned that you have similar units at Keahole, and then you have 2 units at Hamakua Energy Partners. Now you have similar units, you have these economies of scale. We can have contractors maintaining 4 units instead of, well, actually 5 units because we have one in Puna, 5 units instead of 3. So you can then actually lower costs of maintenance, operation and maintenance. That's the strategy behind it. In terms of switching fuels, Isaac didn't mention it, but switching fuels and modifying units for existing fossil fuel units for maximum efficiency is part of the Public Utility Commission's inclinations. They want us to look at fuels like LNG and propane. So it's a little odd that we have a little kind of different philosophies because the governor says, no, we don't want LNG, and the inclinations, which was referenced in the Next Era decision and order, says, go and look at different fuels such as liquid natural gas. It's in there. The commission, as part of the inclination, says go look at lower costs, fossil fuels, while you're moving toward a renewable future. So I just wanted to point that out.
Okay. Here's the final question, and it's a hypothetical. The Public Utilities Commissioner, the governor, the mayor of this island, HECO, MECO, and HELCO all sit down in a room and figure out that what they really need to do is get an independent voice on where to take this utility. So you're put in charge of what the utility will do for the next 2 years. What is your top 2 things you would do, starting with Marco?
Are we talking about all 3 Hawaiian Electric
No,
utilities?
you're running HELCO, you're taking care of energy on this island. It's your top 2 ideas that everybody's going to go with. What are you proposing?
Top 2 ideas. I mean, I don't garner any kudos or support from many in the solar industry for saying too many positive things about the utility company, because unfortunately there's been somewhat of a toxic atmosphere that's developed between people in the solar industry and the Hawaiian Electric companies, which I find rather regrettable, to say the least. But I mean, I happen to believe that that Hawaii Electric Light Company has been doing a pretty darn good job in doing what they need to do in terms of keeping the lights on, keeping the power system reliable, and also integrating renewables. So I don't have any kind of magic bullet fix that a co-op or Hawaii Electric should do differently than it's doing now, except just continuing to do everything that we can to try to reduce costs, to look at alternatives, to look at different fuel sources, to be able to go in the positive direction. But I just don't see any magic bullet fixes. That's not a very satisfying answer, probably, Henry, but to you or to the people in the room. Well, I'll leave it at that, Your Honor.
Jay.
I think for me, the top priority is getting alignment on our plans going forward. Right now, we are spending too much energy kind of opposing each other. What I would try to show in our slide is that I think our interests are all aligned. You know, everyone in this room essentially have the aligned interests, but we have disagreements of how fast and how to go about getting to that 100% renewable that'll lower costs. If we can get alignment on the plan going forward, and we can get alignment with, you know, our customers, community, government, and the utility, then executing the plans ahead, and we get endorsement by all of the authorities, then say if the plan is to go and acquire more geothermal, then we're no longer talking about geothermal. We're talking about how we go about it, which areas are we going to pursue it, how much is government going to contribute to the exploration and determination of a source, and then how we're going to bring in a developer to do it. You know, right now we have a lot of debate, we have a lot of struggles between, no, you need to do rooftop solar, you need to do geothermal. The sooner we get past that and we have a coordinated plan, I think we're going to get there sooner. That, to me, that's really critical, because yes, the utility is there, we're accountable, we're primarily responsible, but the reality is we're not going to get there by ourselves. And we're not going to get there faster if we have so much strife in getting there. I think the sooner we can get alignment, at least on the big ticket issues, the faster and the better we're going to get there.
And Isaac.
Okay, I agree it's about alignment. And not just agreeing for agreeing's sake, but definitely getting, it goes back down to the structure, the model, the market. And that was, I hope, the one takeaway you got from my presentation. The system's geared wrong right now, and we need to shift that. And right now, you know, we're on the 4th version of the plan, like I said, and it was supposed to be about clean energy, But someone, there's certain interest rowing in the other direction because they want to maintain the life of the fossil fuel plants longer, or they want to back it down as much. Because that's the way they make money, okay? So that's the system, and you can't even fault folks for that because money talks or whatever at a certain level. But once we get alignment, not on the plan we need alignment for sure, but more fundamentally on the system, on the model, okay? Then I think we'll find ourselves rowing more in the same direction. And that's the last slide that I mentioned. There's ways that we can do this. If the investor-owned system doesn't serve us anymore, there's other models that we can explore to make sure that the customers and the public are number one. Okay? And so, you can take a look at that slide. The investor-owned model could do it for us, but it's going to have to take a shift. We need to change the incentives because incentives right now are geared towards the fossil fuel burning business. There's, again, Marco can talk about the co-ops, although, I just thought I heard him say that he wouldn't change anything. So, I don't know what change would that would entail. But, at least in principle, there's an allegiance to the membership, and that's a way you can align or realign. And then there's a concept of the independent system operator, where you have an overseer, a neutral third party to make sure that everyone is playing on an equal playing field, and there's no bias toward this utility plant, et cetera. And then, got to go back to Paniolo. They're doing a great service, at least raising the question, can Parker Ranch do it cheaper and then help everyone out by driving the cost down? Forming that so-called microgrid, and others can form their own microgrid and form a new system that's from the bottom up, and serve the public and the customers, going back to the customers and the public first. So we got to find the alignment for sure. I agree 100%. On that issue. It's about alignment.
Great. Can we have a round of applause for Marco and Jay and Isaac?
Wow, sorry. We could do this for another 2 hours and y'all go to sleep. But I wanted just to say a couple things before you leave. First and foremost, let me leave you with one thought. And this is a little bit contradictory to my friend Marco, and that is that in 30 years of IT, I saw a transition from when IBM owned the marketplace of large mainframe computers in rooms much larger than this room, and everybody connected to those mainframe computers had dumb terminals. They basically were keyboards and screens, and that's all it was. Today, we have a full-blown computer right here in my pocket, and you probably have one as well. So I want you to think about that and where we are going with energy. Energy is not just about maintaining the status quo or changing the chairs on the Titanic. It's about moving forward to a clean energy future because, as my friend Isaac pointed out very clearly, we have to do this. It isn't just about how much it costs per kilowatt hour. It's about the climate. It's about having a robust network as we continue to face stronger and stronger storms. A centralized grid is less resilient than a highly robust distributed grid. And each one of you can be a power producer, and you also can be a part of a larger network that can integrate and be robust in the coming times we have ahead of us, which are going to be more extreme storms and more reliability issues if we continue down the current course of our power plan, which is 20th century. So thank you for really having great speakers here. This is the kind of talent we have right here locally. Really. Marco, Jay, and Isaac, thank you for coming in from Oahu, and Henry, thank you for coming in from Oahu. And just thank you all for making this a great forum.
The focus here will be on what the future can hold. And so we'll start off with Robert Harris.
Thank you, Henry, and thank you everyone for the opportunity to be here. About 2 years ago, actually, I was here to speak at NELHA, and I found the Kona community to be the most patient At least they pretended to be interested in talking about energy policy for at least over an hour. And so I jumped at the opportunity to come back. And so thank you so much for allowing me to be here. About a week ago, I received an email advertising a conference on the mainland, and the title was essentially this. And I'd like to, if you don't mind indulging me, play a bit of a game with you. So looking at this, do you think that they were talking about, let's say, the impacts of climate change as caused by the fossil fuels produced by utilities across the mainland? Show of hands. Sorry, that's someone else's problem. Do you think that they were talking about the billions of dollars that are spent on utility projects that are ratepayer funded that actually never proceed, never happen, like the billion-dollar nuclear power plant that was built in Florida that essentially the ratepayers on the hook that actually never got completed? Show of hands. Boy, you guys are smart. This is the biggest threat. And this is what an entire conference is on. I find that amazing, like in a way that you have a source of energy that is clean, that is allowing people to save money. It's sort of a transformation from an industrial way of making power that hasn't changed in over 100 years. And yet we have a system by which this is a threat. This is a problem. This is something that needs to be fixed. I'm dwelling on this just a little bit because I think it is kind of an important frame as we move forward, that we have to recognize that some of our hurdles aren't technical, but maybe sometimes they're just business models that have to be addressed. Ultimately, I do think it boils down to competition. Utilities generally do wonderful things, and I think they're institutions that were created by us deliberately to be cautious, conservative, not terribly innovative entities, because for 100 years, we needed them to build big power plants that cost a lot of money, and in exchange for being a state-sponsored monopoly, they got a guaranteed rate of return over time for building these things and then operating them. And so, it's a model that worked. But now all of a sudden we have a disruptive technology coming on that competes. Utilities, generally speaking, don't view the ratepayers, you, as their customers. And I think that's best exhibited if you attend a legislative session or if you attend a Public Utilities Committee meeting, you'll find dozens of HECO employees in the room following, tracking, because those are their customers. Those are the people that approve the rate increases, that approve the projects that they do. That's the people they have to keep satisfied. Unfortunately, for most people, if you want electricity, you got to buy it from them. And so if this rate is 27 cents, if it's 45 cents, in some ways it didn't really impact the utility all that much. So to some extent, by creating competition, giving people an alternative where you can choose another way to get your energy has created a mechanism where for the first time ever, I think utilities have to be really concerned what their rates are and actually be actively trying to drive the rates down so that they look better than this competition. But also, we just have a changing system, and that's inherently, again, a good thing. In 2012, EEI, Edison Electric Institute, is an entity that's essentially a trade group, a lobbying group on behalf of utilities. Almost every utility is a member of it. And they put out a paper called Disruptive Threats to the Utility Business Model, and they came out with this quote. And then recently, as reported by the Washington Post, they actually had a conference where they actually went into detail about the threat that solar was to their business model. They talked about how it would be difficult to make increased profits over time going forward in this market, and then laid out things that they needed to do to try to change this, including raising fees on solar to try to make it less competitive, and trying to convince legislators and governors that solar was creating a fairness issue. And sort of laid it out in detail, and it was actually kind of surprising the Washington Post got all this information and actually put it out there. And since that 2012 paper, there have been bills introduced in states that have literally like 10 photovoltaic systems in them, basically seeking to undermine solar policy, trying to make it harder to do solar. And we're seeing these issues going across virtually every state in the United States, including ours. And to date, in almost every circumstance, the utilities, and again, other groups too, like ALEC and other, sort of, I'd say sort of conservative groups, but it's not universally true. There's actually been some conservative groups that have been very, very supportive of renewable energy. But generally, they have made it their mission to try to undo renewable energy portfolio standards or undo net energy metering, which has sort of been a bedrock principle of solar. And in almost every circumstance, they've failed. And I think that has a lot to do with the fact that solar is really, really popular. People like it and people want it. And that's really been the main reason why, renewable energy advocates and environmentalists have been successful at trying to keep these policies going forward. I will take a quick tangent and point out we've now done 3 polls over 2 years asking people, do you think we should have more rooftop solar, and asked a lot of variations of that question. And almost consistently, the sports come back at 94%. 6% of people, I suspect, don't know their own name. I'm exaggerating there, but that's about as ubiquitous as you can get. Everybody, across race, political party, location, think that we really should have more rooftop solar here in Hawaii. This graph is way too complicated, and I'll simply explain it. Don't really worry too much about it. But nationally, there have been then these studies, basically looking at whether solar is a net benefit, and every single study that isn't funded by utility to date has found that solar provides a net benefit to the grid, that people who put solar on are actually providing more benefits than they cost. We haven't done such a study here in Hawaii. That's been sort of a cause of contention. And again, Hawaii has a much higher degree of solar penetration, so it's possible we'd have different results. But the reality is, despite consistent messaging saying solar is at cost or there's a issue there, every study so far to date has said something different. So briefly, and again, I apologize, I'm trying to rush through a lot of different topics in 10 minutes, but what is the future of solar? What is it going to look like? I'm going to talk about 2 policies that I think we need to make sure are done right, and I think it's going to lead to the future that I think we all want to see. The first is trying to make sure that we have an appropriate size minimum bill. If you're connected to the grid, there are costs of it, and you should be paying for the general fixed costs, like the poles and the wires and the basic maintenance of that. And it's probably a lot less of a charge than you think it would be. We did a study, hired a top economist to come in and actually do the number crunching, and using HECO's own numbers, and this is set specifically for Oahu, found that the minimum bill should be set at $25.33. That would be the minimum you'd pay every month. For most residents who don't have solar, you buy more electricity than that already. So if you have a $70 bill, it doesn't impact you. But if you have solar and you're trying to drop your bill, you'd have to pay at least this minimal amount per month. Presumably here on this island, in Helco, it might be slightly higher. But again, that's trying to establish something that's fair, possibly lower. The next thing that's important to do is set time of use rates. The cost of a kilowatt of power changes depending on what time of day it is. If you're pulling a kilowatt of power at 2 a.m. in the morning, that kilowatt's relatively cheap. These plants are operating at sort of bare minimum. They want you to use electricity. And so if you're able to set the kilowatt at the right rate, you encourage behavior shifts. So, if at 6 o'clock p.m., say, for example, there's a lot of people pulling power, everyone's coming home, turning on the TV and turning on the oven. If you send signals saying, hey, it's going to be a little bit more expensive at this time, you encourage people maybe to change their behavior a little bit, but you also start creating a policy which allows people to start looking at adding storage. So you soak up the sun during the noon, and then you rely on your batteries to sort of shave that peak, and that winds up becoming a net asset for everybody. Or the storage potentially becomes even a resource where potentially you're putting power back out so your neighbor can use it when they come home. These are basic tenant policies. It's relatively simple. It's the type of thing we really need to be doing here in Hawaii as a leader, and looking at other states who've already done this and say, like, this is a good direction for the future. So one of the things I opened up with is the fact that utilities view solar as competition. And I think that is inherently part of the problem, is that utilities make money off of selling power, selling the kilowatt to you. And so they have an incentive to see that they try to sell more, right? And fundamentally, when you have people who become very energy efficient or when they start generating their own power, that's contradictory to what benefits the utility. So to try to move in the future where we're really seeing 100% renewable energy, we probably have to really address the business structure to try to eliminate that sense that the utility has to try to be adverse to these types of things. And I would suggest there's probably two fundamental models we can look at. The first one, which has been talked about a lot, and there's definitely a group here that is looking at trying to form or co-op, is to try to move something that's more of a publicly owned utility. And so becoming more of a service provider, and hey, if it's in the public interest, great. If the public wants it, that's what we want. And looking nationally, there are thousands of these co-ops or municipalities, and on average, they tend to actually have lower rates. And there's some really good examples of these on the mainland. Now, let me be clear, you have bad publicly owned utilities too. This is not a silver bullet. It doesn't change everything, but it does potentially remove that competition fear or concern or that profit motivation. And you could point to someone like SMUD, where you have utilities, Sacramento, which has had very, very high customer, I think 13 or 14 years in a row, had the highest customer satisfaction ratings nationally, whereas also doing a lot of positive improvements and investments that are really quite impressive. Another one is to, and this is what the Public Utilities Commission here in Hawaii has talked about, is to try to get the utility out of the generation game, so no longer generating power, and becoming more of just a operator of the grid, and they don't care where the electricity is coming from. I would hypothesize that if the NextEra merger fails, like it kind of looks like it's headed towards, that we're really going to be seriously looking here in Hawaii at one of these two options, and each island may wind up being quite different. And this will be, sort of, I think, a topic discussion. So briefly, I'd like to tell a quick story, talking about NextEra. Like, why are renewable energy companies concerned about NextEra coming into Hawaii? So in Florida, it's the Sunshine State, has relatively very little solar. And Florida Power and Light, which is NextEra's utility arm in Florida, is a very large company. And it has done a terrific job at really undermining clean energy goals and energy efficiency consistently. And one small story, and there's many of them, is this. It's happening right now. It's illegal to have third-party ownership of solar in Florida, which is one of the ways you finance solar, right? You potentially could lease it or have a PPA, and it removes that upfront cost concern, the upfront. You have to write a $25,000 or $30,000 check. You just lease it, and you can start off day one of having solar power. And it's become a very popular mechanism. At least 75% of all solar installations now are using this mechanism. So it's illegal in Florida. So a group got together to put on a ballot initiative to say, well, let's make it legal. Let's put it in the Constitution that you can do this. And so they were out getting signatures, getting attention, doing well. And all of a sudden, Consumers for Smart Solar popped up. Slickest website you've ever seen, videos, campaigns, already had a whole bunch of endorsements, $900,000 approximately in funding. About $400,000 of that came from utilities and the Koch brothers, including Florida Power and Light, basically putting out a contrary ballot initiative for smart solar that, if you actually kind of read the fine print, basically would undermine the first initiative. So you can imagine someone showing up, maybe not really know any better, say, yeah, I'll vote for solar. Oh yeah, and smart solar, vote for that too. It's just a very clever, slick, heavy-handed way of doing business that they've been very good at in Florida, better than any other utility, and have really helped prevent solar from happening. It's one story. I recognize you can't necessarily mud out a lot. If we had more time, I'd go into more detail, but this is one that's very recent. Some quick numbers that people should dwell on. So the cost of the acquisition is approximately $4.2 billion. $600 million is going to shareholders. You have $17.1 million that's allocated to the CEOs. And then there's only $60 million guaranteed to ratepayers. And so I would suggest, one of the concerns people have communicated is that, hey, look, don't the ratepayers sort of deserve more guaranteed savings. We really should have more concrete. And we can go into detail that the $60 million actually isn't really a give either. It's actually in some ways a taking. If somebody's interested, please ask that question. I'll go into more detail. Again, I'll just go through these briefly because you've read about this and everybody has an opinion on this. We don't need to go into detail, but one of the concerns is that the problems we've had with HECO is this vertically integrated business model that's really kind of causing problems. And I think Governor Ige expressed it relatively well when he said, well, we're concerned that this business model won't take us to 100% renewable, that it's not a business model that's working anymore. And the problem with NextEra is it's the same business model. And a reporter wisely said, well, gee, isn't HECO the same? And his response, yeah, but they live here. At least we get to talk to them. A concern that there hasn't been any plan portrayed really detailing how they're going to move forward in Hawaii. What projects are you going to do? What do you want to do? How are you going to get us to cheaper, cleaner power? And there's been at least a couple hundred times they've been asked this question. Henry's asked about 50 of them. And briefly, we're not getting that level of detail. History of opposing solar and efficiency, and that this would be a really small part of NextEra's business, and potentially we'd lose a lot of local control. So thank you very much. I'm going to turn it over to the next panelist.
To Paul from Blue Planet.
Great. Thank you.